Good afternoon. Today, January 10th, 1991, we're going to interview Dayle Rainwater. And the interview will be under the auspices of the Dayton Historical Depot Society. And it's in the afternoon, about 1:30, 2 o'clock, and the temperature is probably around freezing or a little bit above. A lot of people were stuck with icy, rainy roads this morning. But anyway, Dayle, here we go. And I would probably start out by asking you to give your name and your birthplace and date and so on.
Well, I'm Dayle Rainwater. I was born on Robinette Mountain, in a canyon actually, going up the mountain on May 20th, 1924. And my parents were Lloyd, Ann, and Catherine D. Rainwater. One of the things that I've always been told about, on my birthday, Ethel Henry walked over in the back of the field, their field, and picked a bunch of Dutch boy baby flowers and brought them down to my mother, which was the last time in history that I remember, anybody remembers, of ever finding those flowers in that canyon. At that time, the Henrys lived a quarter of a mile up the canyon from our place on, I don't know what they call the field, we call it sometimes the Hunt Field. Because the Hunt Field, my Aunt Susan Hunt owned it at one time and then sold it to Leo Henry's dad. Go back a little in history, the Rainwaters first came to the Northwest in 1864 and settled in the Willamette Valley around Albany, Oregon, and were there until 1869 when my great uncle John left the Willamette Valley and came to Dayton. My grandfather fought his way south to Sacramento, California, caught the Union Pacific Railroad and went back to Missouri, and was in Missouri from 1869 till I think it was 1873 when he came back out to Washington. On their way out, they spent the winter of 73, 74 in Canyon City, Colorado, and came on into Dayton the next spring and settled on Robinette Mountain on a piece of property that's still in the Rainwater family. He homesteaded on this place, and it took him about 10 years to get a title to it because when he went to claim title to it, the Northern Pacific Railroad also claimed the land. And it's one of these cases where the Northern Pacific Railroad was given land 40 miles each way from the railroad. It took us a long time to figure out why the Northern Pacific Railroad could claim this land, because it was more than 40 miles to the nearest Northern Pacific line. But in checking, the main line for the Northern Pacific at one time came into the state of Washington about where the Grand Run goes into the Snake River, and came across southeastern Washington to Wallula, which would put it within 40 miles of Dayton. But in 1888, my grandfather received the deed to the place, which is now in the family. When Grandpa Rainwater first came out, he had 6 children that came across the plains with him in an ox wagon, full wagon. And when he went back to Missouri, he had 7. When he came back out, he had 8. The 8th one was born after they came to Dayton. His first wife died in 1879. And Grandpa had, I think, 5 children still at home. And he raised these by himself until 1884 when he married my grandmother, Nellie Laura Pintler. Now, a little history on the Pintler family. They came to Dayton in 1874 from Minnesota. And they homesteaded in an area, Bailey'sburg. I think the property is known as the Ballsman property now. You go back up on the south side of the river in the area where they homesteaded. Grandpa Rainwater and my grandparents had 10 children. Grandpa Rainwater had 18 children altogether. I'm talking about his first family. I only knew 4 of them. Delilah Finkel, Mary Pettyjohn, Press Rainwater, and Etta Dayle. And one thing we might say, Delilah Finkel, her husband Frank Finkel, is now, they think, the sole survivor of the Custer Massacre. And my dad claims it was true, and if my dad said it, I believe it too. Then the family, I say there were 10 children in my family that I come out of from Jacob Rainwater. There was Leonard, Bernard, who died when he was 18, Robert, Jesse, Lloyd, Harry, Hal, Agnes, Leah, and Ada. Grandpa Rainwater died in 1906, contracted pneumonia while working as a road boss on the road and never recovered, leaving Grandma Rainwater with 10 children to take care of.
Oh boy, how old was she at the time?
Grandma Rainwater was, let's see, she was 19 in 1884. That makes her 35. She was about 41 years old.
So she had 10 kids.
And she died in 1938.
Well, now I suppose that some of the relatives and brothers and sisters helped to try to raise the family.
Well, most of the older boys, of course, Bernard was dead, and Dad and Uncle Harry, Lloyd and Harry, did most of the work, stayed home, and did the work on the place, and did practically all the work on the home place, and gave Grandma Rainwater all the income until she died in 1938. The whole place is now owned by my 3 brothers, my sister, myself, and my sister's family, which we're still in the area there, but there's one part of the home place that has never been divided up, and that one time when we went to figure it up, there was 265 heirs to that place, and that was back in 1960. But now we have it so that we're down to about 2 people of getting my family, brothers and sisters' family, like 2 signatures that could be getting a title to that. Well, one of the reasons they say that the people settled up like they did back on the mountain, because when Grandpa Rainwater came to Dayton, all the land out by the airfield, whatever you want to call it, the wall, was open to homesteading. But they didn't think it was any good. They wanted to go up on the mountain where they had wood and water. So that is why a lot of them settled on the mountain.
And, let the good farmland go.
Good farmland, they were looking for wood.
Now, when you say where you were born, Dale, was this at the head of the grade or beyond, further up a ways?
Where I was born is where you go over into your place.
Yeah, the head.
And there's a fork there in the house set right up in the little canyon. That was where I was born. My dad was born a quarter of a mile up top of the hill around the S curves on the right-hand side of it. And my grandfather had that named Hillcrest Farms. And the house was there until 1946, when it was moved to town on 4th Street and later burnt.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question. It seems to me when we interviewed Gene Turner that he said at one time that he lived in the house apparently where you were born then. Is that right?
Gene did not live there, but his dad did. His father, the Turners, lived in the house where I was born. People that I know of that lived in that house were the Clarence Johnsons, the Turners, and the Rainwaters. Mm-hmm. There may have been another family in there. And when we're talking about Robinette Mountain, one interesting thing I know of that a lot of people probably will not realize, we have a field up there that we call the Sayers Field. And this field was owned by R.D. Sayers, who traded it to Broughton's for the Broughton store, which became R.D. Sayers store. And an interesting sidelight to the R.D. Sayers, in about 1951 or 52, I was reading a paper and it talking about one of the top speedboats in the nation, a boat called Slow Motion. And it said it was owned by Stanley Sayers from southeastern Washington. I kept saying Sayers. That name sounds familiar, so I asked my mother and one of my uncles, this sounds familiar. She said Stanley Sayers. Mom piped up, I went to high school with Stanley Sayers in Dayton. So one of the fastest speedboats in the world was owned at one time by a person living that was born and raised in Dayton. Another piece, there was at one time 2 schools on Robinette. Probably a lot of people don't realize there were 2. There was the Robinette Mountain School District, and we always thought it was the Lone Pine School District, but I see on some maps it was called the Rainwater School District. This school, I don't know when was the last time it was used, but the schoolhouse is right under one of the S turns going up top of Robinette Mountain. folks used to use it when I remembered it as a wheat storage. And Dad tore it down and made the bunkhouse at the ranch out of it. And still the wood in the woodshed at Camp Nancy Lee is the lumber. It was built out of lumber that come out of the Lone Pine Schoolhouse on Robinette.
Well, then what you're saying, Dale, that if the school was located right about the first S turns going up Robinette grade.
You go around the high clay bank and make the next S turn, it was right under it.
I see. So the children on up the Robinette Mountain had to come back.
Then you go on back up towards the Robinette Mountain School.
Oh, I see.
That was up on what is known now as the Harris Place.
Mm-hmm.
But then when the school, the Lone Pine or the Rainwater School was disbanded, all those kids were supposed to go to Robinette Mountain School. But when we were going to school, the folks thought that was 5 miles back up the mountain was too far, so they brought us to town. And we moved to town to go to school.
Well, how, in those winter days, how in the world did those kids, the road couldn't have been too good.
They walked.
Walked up there.
Horseback.
On top of the ridge.
The last time that the school was held in Robinette Mountain School was in the school year of 1941-42 was the last time school. And so there have been, I don't know how many families lived on Robinette. We knew that there was a place at the Sayers where we are, the Henry place, our home place, the Geetson place, and an interesting story about the Geetson place. In 1955, the folks got to check in the tax roll, and we were paying taxes on a house across the road from the Geetson place, the breaks of the Salatucci, that my dad never remembered the house being there. Yet in 1955, we were paying taxes on it.
Well, that's an interesting.
Then we go up the mountain. The next place would be, most people know it now as the Donahue place. We know it as the Rhoda place, the Culbertson place. And this was Frank Finkel's homestead. Our farm was now owned by the Donahue family. The people that lived there that I remember were Bob Culbertson, Wally Holmgren, I forget what the Woodworths first, Harley Woodworth's folks, and Clem Rhoda, now the Donahues. Going on back, you had the Hunt place where Dent and Den Hunt with Clyde Hunt, and I don't know who else lived there. Then we come into the Ike Rice place, where Ike Rice, Snyder's, and everybody, which I remember. And other people's families are John Cochran lived next, then George Mays, and several people lived back on the Rhodes place out on the breaks of the Salatucci. You go on farther back, you have the Mitchells, and George Epley, who lived out on the breaks of Robinson Fork on a place now owned by Leo Fletcher. You come back over, you have Colin Johnson lived there. It's now owned by Suffield. Then you go to Arnold Mock, where Fletcher's house is. And one of the stories I always caught when Judge Pat McCabe would come down from Pomeroy, he'd always tell me, I always spent my summers at the Mock house in Robinette and walked down into Robinson Fork to fish, as Arnold Mock was Pat McCabe's grandfather. Then you come back and was Frank Mock, interesting at the time, early time, on a party line. Frank was an old bachelor that lived back up on top of Robin. And it wasn't unusual for him, when he got through a telephone conversation, to hear the phone ring. I didn't get this part of the conversation. What were you talking about?
On the party line.
On a party line. But we had, at our place, we had, until they built the road up the south, up to Robinette to where it is now, the phone line came into our porch, then went back out. We had a little connection up on the wall, on the porch. We could unhook that, cut the whole phone line off up the mountain behind us until they built the new road. Then they took it.
So they couldn't all listen to your conversation.
This is some of the interesting. Other people who lived up there were Matt Roseberry on what place owned by Fletcher's that they known as the Hyman place. There was Herman Cochran lived out on the breaks of the Salatucci. Leo Griner lived back up on the hill in part of Fletcher's. And then we come to where the spike fence is. Probably a lot of people don't know what a spike fence is.
Yeah, you better spell that. So
This spike fence, the spike is spelled S-P-I-T-E. When two neighbors could not agree on where the line was, each one would build a fence. They were probably about 1.5 feet apart. And God help him that stepped his foot in that space between the two fences, because you were liable to be shot. And the people, I think, who it was that built the spike fence was Simon Eggers, and this Eggers is spelled E-G-G-E-R-S, and Jacob Rainwater. Then you go back and you run into the Domin Brinks and the Domin X, and one of the things my dad always told me about this Domin Brink was an old bachelor. And all these old bachelors up there cut wood and raised potatoes, but Domin Brink got a job, or Dominic got a job as a washing machine salesman. One of these old washing machines that had the lever like that, he turned the dasher with, and one of his sales pitches for that is to the women was, you put your baby's diapers in there and you just push it like that and just watch it fly. And then there was the Dominics and the Groats, Rudolph Groat, the Whites, the Edmondsons, and back on the breaks of the Griffinport, the Pearly Mitchells. And I can remember going back with Mother to buy chickens from the Mitchells, way back on above the breaks to the south too. And you go out onto what we call 12 o'clock, and there were the Meltons and the Dixons. And Henry Melton was taught, when he lived there, the school he went to was down on the South Touche. They'd walk off the top of what we call 12 o'clock down to the South Touche and back to go to school. And it wasn't until about 2 months ago that I found out what the name of that schoolhouse was. I was talking to one guy and he said there was a schoolhouse up there. Don't know what the name was, and we got to mention the people who lived up the South Touche, and I mean, well, we owned a place that Dollar Heights used to own. He said, that's the name of the school. The Dollar Heights School was about a mile down the creek, about a mile down the creek from the mouth of Griffin.
Well, just when you look back at it, Dale, how many people would you guess lived on that mountain back in the days of your dad and so on?
And around the turn of the century, there were probably 30, close to 30. On the place that we farmed on Robinette, at one time, there were 7 different families lived on that one place. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is, one of the houses and one of the barns on that place, the barn is now out and back of where Bob Harding lives. That barn was built on Robinette and moved to town. And the house was moved down to, it used to sit where Willie Jordan's trailer house is. It burned, but that was the house that came down there. And they were telling at one time that people came home from visiting, I don't know who they were visiting, and the mountain cougar chased them into the house in that area.
Well, go ahead, Dale.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, how many people live on Robinette Mountain now, or all these other folks?
People that actually live on Robinette Mountain right now, and they're out because they don't have any water right now, are Kelly and Shelley Donahue and their daughter. And they're the only ones that live on, I think, in about right after the war, practically everybody moved off except the people that lived in the Donahue place and the Geeks place. Everybody else had moved off the mountain, except no, I take it all back. We had Tony Hensley lived way back up on the mountain, but he moved down about 1960. We always called him Tony on the mountain.
Well, what would you say the reason was that when there were a lot of people, a couple of schoolhouses and all the rest, and then all of a sudden today, 1991, there isn't anybody. What happened? Why did everybody get out?
These little stump farms, they couldn't make a living and sold out, and the market for wood potatoes ran out. So people started out. A lot of those places, what we know as the Rainwater Ranch, that was put together, and a lot of people don't know it. About 2/3 of that ranch was the mountain pasture or the Mead Ranch that was put together by Dr. Patrisky. And when he sold it, he sold the place to Groats. Groats sold it to McGowan's, and McGowan sold it to the Rainwaters. So actually this mountain ranch of ours and the Mead Ranch were the same ranch at one time. And one other interesting story that I got out of my dad while riding in the mountains looking for cattle one summer. We rode by a pitch stump. And as we rode by, my dad said, there's some good trading material. We went a little farther, and I forgot the name at him and said, "What the heck do you mean by trading material?" Well, he said these old bachelors up on the mountain used to get hard up. And they'd cut a load of pitch and go to town and visit all the widows in town, trade them pitch, and I'll leave you to your own conclusions of what they were trading for.
Well, one of the things, Dale, when you were, say, a wee boy and you look back at this, or maybe you heard your folks talk about it, what were the roads like? How often did people come to town for supplies and so on?
Most of them, when I was up till the time I was about 9, the road came down the top of Robinette Mountain and came down a canyon and came out onto the South Touche, right where Bert Kirchhoff lives. And
So that's within, what, a quarter of a mile of the bridge now?
Yes.
Over the river.
And one, I can remember, like I said, we always moved to town in the wintertime. And the folks moved us back one spring with a truck, moved us to the ranch one morning. They came down on the grade, picked us up with a team and sled, hauled us to the ranch, because that's where all the furniture was, loaded the furniture back up on the truck, on a wagon, brought it to town, and we were in town 6 weeks more. And that was in March, so we were snowed out of the ranch off the road until near the 1st of May. And the road up Robinette Mountain, that is now, is quite an interesting story. Vern Holman was county commissioner. He knew he was going to get defeated in the election in 1932 when Roosevelt swept the Democrats in. So he got the road started. They surveyed the road out. Cub Winnett was the engineer, and he said the road will be 60% rock and 40% dirt. The contractor took the bid at 40% rock, 60% dirt. Well, it ended up it was 70% rock and 30% dirt. And that was probably one of the last road contracting jobs that the George Price construction outfit had. It practically broke him. Another one was the job to gravel the road was awarded to the Rogers Brothers. And that was one of the first contracting jobs the Rogers Brothers construction had, was graveling the Robinette Mountain Road.
What year do you think roughly that was, Dale?
The road was built in the winter of 33, 34, and at one time at the foot of Robinette they had a barn built when they were constructing the road that would hold 106 head of horses and mules that they used. And winter of 33, 1933 I think it was, they used all of our horses and mule teams that we farmed with were used on the road.
Well, you mean your dad's uncle or whoever
We just
would
leased the mules out to him, and Price leased our mules and had his own men driving them.
And you say it almost broke these fellows to build that. Now, was that because it was such a difficult thing to...
Well, they took the bid as 60% dirt and 30% rock and come in with a bid that was too low because they had to blast, and it was much more expensive than what they thought it was going to be, that it practically broke them right there.
But they, is that the, when you, just before you get to the turns, the S-turns, the top of the grade, there's a kind of a cut into the bank there. Is that the old rock?
The rock pit is before you get, before you go into your place up there. There's a hole back in the road on the right hand, just on the upper side of a ditch, and that's where the rock pit was.
Okay, I wondered oftentimes going up there because I see some round rock that looks like river rock instead of blasted material, and I suppose that was put on.
That was the gravel pit was there on the side of the road. And when you come down a ways farther, you will see spots that look like they took itself off the hillside. That's where they were trying to get dirt out of the road.
Well, that's interesting.
As bad as that Robinette Mountain Road is, there have been very few wrecks on the road. I think I know about 2 cars that ever went over the side of that road.
Well, because there's only 2 guardrails right at the bottom and about 2 turns and not much of that either. Well, let's see, Dale, now as a young boy, now were all your brothers and sisters born up in the ranch house there?
My 3 brothers and myself were born in the ranch house. My sister was born in town. I forget what they called the house. It was, I think now where the Lutheran church is. A lay-in house or something, and that's where all the women went and had their babies, and that's where my sister was born. As far as I know, the 4 of us 4 boys were born on Robin Inn.
And your sister was born at the time. Well, I was going to ask you now, what entertainment, when everybody lived up there, there were a lot of families, were there any get-togethers, or what happened for?
Well, I don't remember events very many because we came to town. And see, our nearest, the Henrys had moved off by the time I was old enough to remember, because I think they moved, but before your wife, Mary Ellen, before they had moved off the mountain, I think.
Probably about 1920, somewhere along in there.
Well, they were there in 1924, because that's when I was born. But there was, what we used to do, there used to be an old road cut down, an old farm road went down the canyon, below where the road goes up Robinette Mountain. And we had, folks had a little team of mules that belonged to my two older brothers called Hawk and Whirlwind. We had a buggy, a hack, 2-seated hack, and we'd load up all the kids in the hack and down the mountain, we'd go to the creek, and we could find a hole big enough to get wet. That was our entertainment, was coming down to the creek, trying to find a hole to swim. Our Aunt Ada used to come up and go with us. Another, well, we used it home for a lot of our recreation, horseback riding. We had all the kids, we had one horse that belonged to 5 of us. And probably more kids than come to the county learned to ride this little horse. It was quite a combination. His mother was a circus horse. And the circus went up to Earl Harding's and got a load of straw, and this colt went along with it. When they left, it stayed, and Harding's gave us the colt. And it stayed one winter, it and a bull ran in the mountains all winter, about the mouth of Griffin Fork. And when they went to break him to ride, pretty near killed George Bailey and Ted Tate. They had one heck of a time trying to break him to ride. But he turned out to be a kid's horse until one year we had a man working for us at Starbuck who broke him to rear up and down, his little so-and-so. When he didn't want to go any place to leave the barn, he reared up and bucked. And then one night, he threw my brother Raymond off into the plowed field when he was out after the milk cows. A little later, Dad was going to take him and go out and chase the cows out of the wheat. And he threw me off in the county road on my nose.
Oh, boy.
And the last time the horse was ridden, older brother Lloyd and I rode him together, and he bucked with us all the whole time we were out in the field trying to catch the cows. But we found him when he died. You see, he and my older brother Lloyd were the same age. We found him wrapped around a fence post over the high bank on the S turd, laying there. You could tell he was just waiting, because he knew sooner or later someone was going to find him. We brought him in the barn and died in the barn. He was an ornery little devil, and he stood in the barn and got as much grain and hay to eat as the work tools. When they fed the work mules and horses when they came in out of the field, Billy stood there and got his hay and grain just like the rest of them.
Well, that's really interesting, Dale. While we're talking about that, Mike said that we ought to mention your brothers and sisters, sister by name, kind of in order of birth.
Oh, yeah. Our family, 5 children. Frances, Nellie Frances, what her name was the oldest. She was born in 1918. Lloyd Jr. in 1920. Raymond, 1922. I was born in 1924, and Dean was born in 1926. We're just 2 years apart, or approximately 2 years apart. When our birthdays were even number years, the year that on the calendar would be even. But that's the way it worked. And one other interesting thing, a smallpox vaccination will not take over me. I had the smallpox. Mom, Dad, Dean and I had the smallpox when I was 5 years old. And we were quarantined in the house on the ranch for 6 weeks. With a quarantine sign on the front door when we left. Lloyd Raymond, we had moved back to the ranch in the spring, for the spring work. Lloyd Raymond and Frances had come to school that morning. And they didn't get back, when they came home from school that night, they didn't get back home for 6 weeks. They had to stay on the creek with Uncle Harry. Well, Uncle Harry, the quarantine sign was on the front door. Nobody was supposed to come in the house. But the quarantine sign was on the front door, so he came in the back door. And he brought us in for 6 weeks. He brought the stuff in for us and come in once a day. And it was so bad that Dad darn near died with smallpox. And when they came up, they had to fumigate the whole house. And the day they fumigated it, we loaded everybody up and went up the South Tucson for a picnic. And there we stayed until they came back. If you ever been into a house and fumigated, when you come back, it's quite a smell.
Gosh, well, that was an experience. Now, did your brothers and sisters all stay on the ranch and help for a while, or did as they went to school?
Well, most of Francis married Wayne Spooner. Wayne did a lot of the work on the ranch after we got the tractor. He was driving tractor for my Uncle George when he and Francis got married, and Dad bought the cattle. Made Uncle George mad because Wayne quit and came to work for Dad. And after most of them, when they come out of college, never came back to the ranch. Lloyd was, came back for a while, because right after the war we were running a sawmill, and you find out 4 brothers and a brother-in-law running a sawmill. Doesn't work. Everybody wants to be a boss and nobody wants to be a peon.
Now, that was World War II?
Yeah, after World War II, the 4 boys all were all in the service. Lloyd went in 42, Raymond in 42, I went in 43, and Dean went in 44. And when we came back out, Lloyd went back to Eastern and got his teaching degree, went into teaching. Raymond became an accountant, worked for Green Giant for a while, then went to Seattle for cement company now lives in Anchorage. Dean took business administration, came home, went back to the war, the Korean War, married a gal whose uncle was in his outfit, never saw her until about the time they were married. And one interesting sidelight on this, Dean's first wife, was a year ahead of my wife in high school in Hutchinson, Kansas.
Well, I'll be here.
Of course, I understand they weren't the best of friends. But all 4 of the boys have college degrees. Lloyd's degree is from Eastern. Raymond spent his first 2 years at Eastern, graduated from Washington State, and Dean and I both graduated from Washington State. And when I graduated from my college, I came back to the ranch and been there ever since.
Now, what did your sister do?
Frances worked for, don't ask me how many years, as secretary of the school. And she finally, through correspondence and night courses at Columbia Basin College, did get I forget what her degree was called, but she died about, I don't know, when 5 or 6 years. The funeral was the day after her high school class' 50th graduation, so it would have been in 1930, but she died in 1985.
And she worked at the high school, practically ran the office there, didn't she?
Well, I've heard that story that she ran the school. I don't know.
Well, Mary Ellen was the secretary for the grade school, and her sister was in the high school, and she was doing more than just.
Well, when she retired, she was listed as the business manager for the school under Vic Anderson.
Well, Dayle, we're kind of maybe moving ahead a little bit, because I wanted to ask you, as a boy, what did you do? What was your job before you went to school, and when you went to school as a young fellow?
Well, one story, they would not let me hoe potatoes, because they sent me out to hoe potatoes one time, and I was mad because I couldn't go to the mountains that day. And I hoed the potatoes all right. When I got through, the weeds were left and the potatoes were all gone. So they've never let me hoe potatoes since then.
Was there any consequences because of hoeing up potatoes?
And another one I got into, when I was 11, we hauled pea hay all summer to a stationary baler. And finally we were hauling hay out on the hillside, and I was driving 4 mules on a sled, and I got mad. My uncle got mad, told told me I couldn't ride in the back of his hay wagon. I'd have to haul the breeder mules out there, and that made me mad. So I tied him up to the bench and went down in the field where they were thrashing. Told my dad, and he said, well, you ride on the combine till noon and we'll show you what, then we'll see what happens. So I very easily got a crowbar and was sitting there cleaning the grease off the side of the combine. All of a sudden, the crowbar slipped and all the blades on the top band of the combine went out, which effectively shut us down. Well, I got it going again, and Dad says, you better ride with me in the truck after this. And Uncle George Baldwin came in at noon, and he said, I'll give you all the money that I got in my pocket if you will take one of those broken fan boards, because the Waldings were helping us hard, and give it to your dad to spank you with. So I gave Dad the board and turned it over. This is where I got ahead of myself. This is when he said, you better ride with me in the truck the rest of the day. I got 7 cents out of it.
7 cents. Did you get a paddle to go with
I
it?
did not get the paddle.
You got the 7
but
cents?
I got a lecture. But I didn't go back driving the mules back the rest of that year. We have a picture at home of me in a hay wagon in front of the old house, and I'm just as proud as I can be, because that team of mules had ran off 3 times that summer. Whenever they heard anything rattle, they ran. They gave me an iron-tongued wagon, and the butt chains were always rattling. And those mules never did run off.
Well, that's good. Well,
Well, I'm not supposed to be using my hands. Go ahead. I'm getting
Yeah.
what you want to say.
Well, we might as well say that Mike Floyd is running the camera today, and he'll probably ask some questions. And we have, well, we didn't get to your part of being married, but we might as well get to that spot now, because Dale's wife Faye is here, and she might even want to ask him a question or correct him. I don't know which.
Well, the way Faye and I got acquainted, she was hired as a county extension agent, came out of Kansas, and it happened that the county agent was also my fraternity brother. I was informed the night day she was hired that she had been hired, but I was also informed at the time I was not to appear in the extension office for at least 6 weeks after she was hired. And I don't know how I got lucky with it. You know, she agreed to marry me in October of 1962, and we've been married a little over 28 years now. And I find that she, for a gal who come out of town, has done a real job in keeping me in line, and is one of the best helpers I've had on the ranch. And she's not too scared to get out in the manure with chasing the cow. Sometimes it makes her mad. She said, of course I'm going to go up with you to help you feed. But once in a while she'll lay in bed and let me do the feeding by myself.
Well, is her background from the...
Her background, her dad was a carpenter, a woodworker, and an excellent craftsman. But her grandparents had a small farm on her dad's side of the family, had a small farm in Miller, Kansas. Now, Miller is a town that isn't even as big as Dixie. I don't know if there's anything left in Miller now, is there? But she grew up in Hudson, Kansas, attended junior college at JUCO, or Hudson Junior College, and graduated from Southwestern University in Winfield, Kansas. And this brings up another little interesting story. We had gone to a Cooper Club meeting one time in Walla, and one of the assistant coaches, I forget what his name is now, he was a head coach at Purdue. I was talking to him, I said, well, where did you go to school at? He said, oh, I went to a school nobody's ever heard of. I said, nobody. I said, well, he said, it was in Kansas. I said, that's where in Kansas did you go to school? He said, Southwestern at Winfield. And it down there shocked him when here was another alumnus at Southwestern in the room with him.
I might interject here. I mean, I know where Southwestern University College is in Winfield, Kansas. Kay and I lived there for a while during World War II. That's where I learned to fly P-47s.
Another interesting
being able to this out.
Well, that's interesting. That's Mike Floyd just said that he knew that.
Another interesting sidelight when we're going like this, the last county that they worked in Kansas, Russell County, Kansas, which is the home of Senator Bob Dole, they knew on the fair board. But she said when she came to Dayton, she was working with some of the same family names, actually the same families. The Roggs, they were winter archers there, the Roggs. Fact is, Mrs. Rogg, Earl Rogg's mother, folks' homestead was in Russell County, Kansas. And she went to the Landons, lived in Russell. So there are several families, and the Russells in Dayton, Russell County, Russell, Kansas, is named after that family. So here he goes, he comes halfway across the country and is still working with some of the same families.
Well, that is interesting, isn't it? Well, probably one of the things, Dale, we kind of sailed through your, probably your period in your life where you went to grade school and high school. You know, if you had any things you remember about that, and then into when you went to WSU, and I don't know whether that was before or after the service, but...
My first school that I attended was the Upper 4th Street Primary, which is the house now that Jim Munden lives in on 4th Street, where you turn to the upper entrance to the cemetery. At one time was the Upper 4th Street Primary. I attended the first grade in the Upper 4th Street Primary, and then it was closed down and we went on then into Central grade school. Went through Central, graduated, went into high school, and probably one of the outstanding things I could always remember about being in high school was on the morning of December 8th, 1941, they called us all down to all the juniors and seniors, had us in the gym while we listened to President Roosevelt declare war on the Japanese. At that time, we didn't know what was going to happen, but I was lucky enough that I first went to Washington State in the fall of 1942. And I always tell everybody it took me 8 years to get out of college. I spent the first semester in college and 2 weeks into the second semester, and started the second week in college, all but about 300 of the male students at Washington State checked out at one time because they called the enlisted reserve corps up. Well, I was mad because folks wouldn't let me join the enlisted reserve corps, but I had to quit too because the draft board told me if I wanted to help my folks through harvest, I'd better get home. And I stayed out and didn't go into the service until fall of 1943, and then was in the service for 2.5 years. Spent all my time, as I say, ETO, Eastern Texas and Oklahoma. And I was discharged in April of 1946 and went back to college in fall of 1946 and graduated in February of 1950. One of the interesting experiences I had in college was manager of the Washington State football team in 1948. Of course, we didn't win very many games, but we had some terrific ball players such as Jerry Williams, Don Paul, Laverne Torgerson, Laurie Meany. All these guys were friends of mine, and I still run into them once in a while.
Well, that's interesting. Well, excuse me, go ahead.
And my degree out of Washington State is actually in general agriculture with a specialty in animal science, and I lacked 1 hour of being able to teach high school chemistry because it was sort of bad. I was going through college when I graduated on a 1942 catalog. Practically all the rest of the students were on a 46 catalog. I have the required courses to teach high school chemistry, but when I took one subject, it was a 3-hour course instead of a 4-hour course.
Well, at that time, were you thinking about coming back to the farm and helping your dad?
I always wanted to come back to the ranch. But when I graduated, everybody that I graduated with thought I came back as herdsman for Rogers.
Well, we heard.
The head of the animal science department at Washington State, Dr. Andermeyer, had the job for me if I wanted it. but I went this other way.
So then you got married there after now, because we jumped ahead there a little bit.
Well, I got married, I'd been home from college for 12 years before I got married.
You were helping your dad.
I was helping my dad.
Well, that's interesting. And I know that you guys have quite a bit of timberland and so on up in there. Now, did you use that for pasture or timber?
The original mountain range that Rainwater's had, a lot of it was purchased in around 1915. And they ran cattle on the mountain range. And we held a permit on the National Forest until about 1963, when we gave it up when they made it, the conditions so rough that we had to leave, we couldn't afford it. And I keep telling people that we talk about the elk problem on Robinette Mountain, the South Touche and the North Touche. The elk came when we came off the National Forest with our cattle. About 2 years later, the elk came out with us. So I feel that part of the elk problem in the county as a result of cutting a lot of the livestock off the National Forest. Another interesting experience we used to have on the ranch was about the first part of June is helping the Hales' sheep outfit drive their sheep up the mountain up by our place. They would drive their sheep from out north of Pasco, drive them to Twin Buttes. And their trail, the way they trailed was up through town, came down over Weinhardt Hill, up through town, up Robinette, out over top of Day Mountain, headed Wolf Fork, and then on into Twin Buttes. At one time, in your reading history, you'll hear about the old timers in Dayton going fishing on the Salmon River. And they go out and pull up Robinette, out over Day Mountain, and down to Winahaw, down to the mouth of Grand Ronde, go across the Snake River, go into the Salmon River fishing, horseback.
Well, that'd been a pretty good day or two's ride to even get there, wouldn't it?
Yes,
Probably
it would.
about 3 days, I suppose.
And then there's another interesting side. On the Air Force maps, the early part of World War II, they listed the Gross Post Office. And probably nobody knows, will remember where the Gross Post Office was. And it was a hollow tree on the side of Day Mountain, up Griffin Peak, where the George Rose Trail came out of the South Touche, out of Griffin Fork up to the top of the mountain, and there was a hollow tree up there was listed as the Gross Post Office.
Well, I'll be there. Well, you know, Dale, back here earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the Nancy Lee camp. Would you tell about that a little bit?
Camp Nancy Lee was, well, I forget what the date was. It was about 1957. The folks gave the property. They were looking for a place for a camp in Nancy, and the folks gave them the spot where Camp Nancy Lee is now. And this also was the site of the old Tate Schoolhouse. And so I was sitting there thinking, and the folks were talking about that they were giving it. I said, why don't you just make a stipulation that they name it Nancy Lee? And the reason it was named Nancy Lee is my older brother Lloyd's daughter was a victim of multiple sclerosis. I don't know. She never learned to walk or talk to this day. She was born in 1948, so Camp Nancy Lee is named, the folks requested the campfire at the time, asked them if they would name it Nancy Lee after their handicapped granddaughter, which was done. The campfire had it till about 4 years ago then, when they joined the Dayton Washington group, joined the Walmart group. They no longer wanted it, so they wanted the camp, so they gave it back to us. And we didn't really want it. So about 3 years ago, we donated the land back to the Kiwanis brothers. So Camp Nancy Lee is now owned by the Dayton Kiwanis Club. But that's where it got its name. It was named after a niece of mine who was severely handicapped.
And that, now the location of that is on your...
The location of that is right on the north end of what is known as Rainwater Ranch. At the end, right at the end of the county road. It so happens that when the road was abandoned, and they made sure that the South Touche Road was abandoned south of the bridge at Camp Nancy Lee. So the county had to keep the bridge open.
So you're saying then, Dale, that after you came back and helped your dad on the ranch and got married and so on, now in the period of time in the farming, I guess the machinery wouldn't be, well, it's similar to what's being used as present day in 1991, pretty much, isn't it?
Well, growing up, I can remember that all the work was being done with horses and mules, and we bought Dad bought his first tractor was in 1936, so I was 12 years old. Pulling the combine with mules was in 1936. We started out in harvest, and we didn't get through harvest when they hired a guy with a cat to pull the combine. That was the last time we used the combine. The last time we used a stationary outfit was 1933. And I can remember part of that. And I always remember that when we finished harvest, we pulled the header wagons, the headers, stuff around the barn, and hooked our horses and mules off of it. Henry James, who would be Randy James' great-grandfather, hooked his teams onto the state or header boxes and headers, went down the mountain, and that was the last time we had a stationary out there. We bought our first self-propelled in 1960. So I have seen in my lifetime, coming from horses and mules to what we're now using as farming equipment. And one of the things we talked about what we did, Dad always made sure we had at least 3 milk cows. The 3 older boys had to milk a cow. We get in an argument, Dean says he milked, but I don't think he ever milked a cow over 2 or 3 times. But we had the cows to milk. Of course, we worked in the harvest, hay. And I keep telling people I never learned to swim. I said, when I grew up, the biggest body of water I ever saw was a watering trough full of water.
You're a long ways down to the bottom of the creek.
Yeah, they go swimming. But we made our own. They used to tell about my barn full of stick horses. I had at one time, they said up along the sidewalk, the boardwalk of the old ranch house, I had 32 stick horses tied up in the barn, and every one of them had a name.
So that's how you kind of made some of your own entertainment.
We made our own entertainment.
Yeah. Well, Dale, speaking of that now, when part of the thing you were doing, you're right on the breaks of the Toucan where you could look down into where the orchard is down there now. Do you recall when that orchard was planted there on the...
No, I don't. You've got the wrong one. Breaks of the North Toucan.
Okay.
I don't know when that orchard was built, but at one time, years before I was born, my grandfather Newell built an apple grater that did a whale of a job, and he sold it back to somebody, some big company, and they just locked it up and never used it. Which brings up the other side of my family. I talked about the Rainwater and the Pinckers. And the other side of the family through my mother were the Newells. And they came out of the Black Hills of South Dakota in 1904. Mom was, I think, 9 years old when the first time she ever saw an apple grow was when they came into Dayton. And they settled in Ring Canyon first, and from Ring Canyon they bought the place where Jerry Webster now lives. My grandfather bought that, and fact is, my mother was living in that house when she and my dad...
Now, where is that, Dale? I don't know.
Right at the house just above our place, next door to us,
Oh,
where Randy James used to live.
Okay, so you tell them the kind of the location there from the bridge.
It's about a half a mile up the South Touchy from the bridge on the right-hand side. And people that I remember that lived there, Webster's lived there now. Randy James lived there, Clark James lived there, Searles lived there, Clavinals lived there, Aaron Hattie, Ray DeBoz, or Tony Bonchulo. But
Well, that's
so
quite...
my mother, from the time she was married, and when she died, she was living within 100 yards of those 2 places.
Well, that'd be there.
And my dad moved down the creek from up on the mountain and lived there in that, on the South Touchy North Prominent Mountain all his life.
Well, that's interesting, Dale, and maybe we ought to talk about some of the things you've done along with the farming. I know you've been active in various different organizations, and maybe you'd like to.
Well, I've had quite a lot of enjoyment working in different organizations, like the Farm Bureau. I'm a past president of the Columbia County Farm Bureau. And right now I'm president of the Columbia County Livestock Association. Was first president, I think it was 30 years ago when I was first president of the Cattlemen's Association. I've been, a lot of people don't know, but I was the chairman of the Conservation District at one time. I'm a past master of Dayton Lodge number 26, Sonic Lodge, past master, past high priest of Royal Arch, Mason. Was a former member of American Legion. Served one term on the school board, and my favorite expression about that, that's one job everybody ought to have once. If you run for it the second time, you ought to have his head examined. And I can truthfully say I'm probably one of the few school board members who was sued practically all the time he was on the school board. It was only 6 months of my full 4 years that I wasn't in court.
Well, no wonder one term looked like enough, I guess. Well, probably one of your favorite ones was the cattle.
My favorite one is the Cattlemen's Association, which of course I was interested in livestock, majoring in animal science in college, and I've had a real enjoyable time in the Cattlemen's Association. I served as their game and farmer sportsman chairman for about 7 years, and I had a co-chairman a lot of that time, and the co-chairman was a guy by the name of Stu Bledsoe, who most people remember as a state legislator and a director of agriculture. I was on the executive committee twice of the Washington Cattlemen's Association, and one of the big things I like to do now is to attend the Cattlemen's legislative days at the state legislature. And it's something that I think everybody ought to have the opportunity to spend some time at the state legislature to see how the laws and the people who are running the state of Washington.
Well, that's interesting, Dale. I know I watched you work on those many years and know you've done a lot of good things there. Maybe now we could take a look at, you have some pictures here, and maybe we could recap, Dale, just briefly now when these relatives first came here. You said they came down to California?
Came to Willamette Valley, and then went back to, my grandfather went back to Missouri and then came back out to Washington. My great uncle John came when he left the Willamette Valley, came to Dayton in 1869, and his homestead was all the south end of Dayton. From my about come to, and the city cemetery, I've always been told that he donated quite a lot of the ground for the city cemetery. Oh, another interest to me is interesting is on the first fair board that ran the first fair in Dayton, my grandfather and my great uncle were both members of the first fair board.
Well, yeah.
And Grandpa Rainwater was quite active in the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, and he was also active in the Republican politics. And he did serve in the Civil War, I think, for 6 months. And I get a notion I'm not supposed to tap my foot anymore. Another thing that really excited me, we were back in Kansas, and Faye was looking up her family genealogical family tree in state capital, Topeka, and I found in the census for Ray County, Missouri, where Jacob and Lucinda Rainwater had signed the census form in 1860.
So they came, now some of them came from Missouri then to the Willamette Valley.
Oh yeah, they came from Missouri to the Willamette Valley, then Grandpa went back to Missouri. He went into Kansas, they came out of Arkansas, and we have traced the Rainwater family, we have them back to 1790 or before the Revolutionary War in North Carolina. We got them clear back to where the Rainwater name changed to Regulus. And I can always say part of the Rainwaters came out of Dolly Park country, in Sevier County, Tennessee.
Oh, neither. Well, that's interesting, Dale. Now, this was all, when they did come out here, it was by wagon train?
Yeah, I had always heard that Grandpa had taken a wagon train back to Missouri, but in some of the later history we got, he had a pretty rough time going from the Willamette Valley to Sacramento with a covered wagon, as he would have gone back to Missouri, but he went back as by railroad. And I can remember one of my uncle, my dad's half, telling about seeing a man scout by an Indian chief in their camp going west.
Well, that's a...
So I have actually talked to people in my lifetime who came across the plains in a covered wagon. This uncle came across twice. One time as he was I think he spent 1 or maybe 2 years as a hunter for wagon trains coming across the plains.
Well, that's really interesting. Most people, when they finally got here, were so glad they stopped and stayed, but he went back and forth and scouted and probably...
and the second time Grandpa Rainwater came, he was the wagon captain, train captain when he came out.
Are he in any of these pictures?
Okay.
Okay, Dale, maybe we could talk about these pictures a little bit and any sidelights that you can remember.
Okay, the picture I was showing is a picture of my grandparents, Jacob Sesson Rainwater, and Sesson spelled C-E-S-N-U-S, I think, or no, Sesson, yeah, Rainwater. And one of the things I forgot when we were talking about my grandfather's, he was quite an innovator. Some of the crops that he raised on Robinette Mountain, he raised tobacco. He experimented with peanuts, raised the first field peas in Columbia County. So he was quite an innovator in that way. He also raised horses and shorthorn cattle.
Well, that's kind of...
And when we talk about cattle, my dad remembers the first Hereford bulls he ever saw in Columbia County were brought in by Dr. Patriston. And he said they were the knot-headedest looking bulls you ever saw.
What year, Dale, would you say that?
This was taken in 1884. This is my grandparents' wedding picture.
Okay, and where would the location, you know?
They were married in her parents' home in Baileysburg.
Baileysburg. Well, that's very interesting. Now maybe this other picture here you can...
Okay, we have one other picture. I don't know.
Well, I don't know where you... Okay, Dale, let's take a look at this other picture now, and you go ahead.
Okay, this is a picture of what I say is my grandfather's second family, of which I come from. And in the back row, starting here, is the oldest boy, Leonard, who lived most of his life in Spokane. The next one is Jessie, who was just older than my dad. She lived her life in Spokane. The next one is Robert, who left Dayton in about 1926, went back to Indiana, and didn't come back to Washington until 1950, and he still thought we were farming with horses and mules. When he came back out in 1950, he couldn't feature tractors running around the hill. The next one is Bernard, and Bernard died in 1905. He was 19 years old, and apparently from what I hear, he was the bronc rider of the family. And then starting the next row here is my Uncle Harry, the next, who was with my dad, farmed with my dad up until his death in 1950. The next one is Aunt Aggie, or Agnes, and one story about her, she was always so scared when she graduated from college, from high school, they were going to give her full name, Agnes May Rainwater. And then there's my grandfather, my Uncle Harold, who was crippled with polio when he was about 8 or 10. He was one time was city treasurer for Dayton and ran a little, I don't know what kind of little junk store on Main Street until his death. Then my grandfather, and the one on the end, it was my dad. And so but there were 2 more children who were not born yet at this time, Leah Balding Force and Ada Rainwater, who were the youngest. They always said, these kids are about 2 years apart in age, 1 or 2 years apart. And Grandpa and Grandma must have had a fight because there was 4 years difference between my Aunt Agnes and my Aunt Leah. So they figured they weren't talking to each other for about 4 years.
Well, now what, Dale, do you know about what year that picture was taken?
Well, let's see. Well, that would have to have been taken about 1900 probably. See, Dad was born in 1891. Grandpa Rainwater died in 1906. So, and Aunt Leah was born in 1903 and Aunt Ada in 1905. So that was taken sometime around before 1903, and I think it was probably after 1900.
Well, Dale, I want to thank you. I want to thank Mike Floyd, that did a good job here with the camera today, and Faye, Dale's wife, is here. And would either of you folks have a question or something you might add? Okay, well, Dale, we thank you very much for coming in today and being part of the Dayton Depot Historical Society interviewing program. Thank you, Dale.
You're welcome.